All right, so now that it is 3:30, we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, How to Accurately Forecast for Job Growth. My name is Holden Andrews, and I will be the host for today. Our two speakers are Chris Chmura, our CEO and Chief Economist, and then Greg Chmura, our Chief Quality Officer. So if you're new, we always like to start off our webinars with just a little bit of who we are and what we do here. So Chmura Economics and Analytics provides labor market data and analysis so our clients can make informed decisions to help their communities and businesses thrive. We were founded in 1998 by Chris. And we have two offices, one in Richmond and the other in Cleveland. We are data scientists, statisticians, mathematicians, and business professionals who truly care about helping your community and your business grow. We are driven by client satisfaction and success. Satisfaction is our first, or excellence, is our first priority. So we have these four pillars or ideals that guide us. They are excellence, and then thorough, accurate, and useful. And these are really what guide us as an organization. They drive us, and they are what we aspire to be. One way we try to exemplify those values is through our weekly economic update report. This is something that we send out for free once a week with the most up-to-date national data. And if you would like to be on this, I will put a link in the chat here in a minute. Before I pass things off to Chris, Chris, would you mind stopping your share and then resharing the slides? I think they're a little bit blurry, and when we get into the content, I'd like to see if we can get that fixed.
Okay. Let me try that one more time.
Okay. I'm currently not seeing anything. If you are in the chat, okay, I've got them in the chat. Could you please just say, you can see them if the slides are available and hopefully not blurry for you, please. Awesome. We've got, okay, I think we're good for now. If it is still a little blurry, the screenshots of this page aren't going to be legible at the moment. So, all right, here we go. Chris, before I pass things off, I would like to mention the slides and recording will be sent out to all attendees tomorrow. This will be free of any blurriness or fuzziness, just based on how it's recorded. So there shouldn't be anything to worry about there. And then if there are any questions during the webinar, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Holden. Before I get started with my part of the presentation, then I'll hand it off to Greg. Just wanted to make you aware that after 2 years of no users conference during COVID, we will be holding one October 9 through 13. And it will be at the Ritz-Carlton in Cleveland, Ohio, where you'll be able to talk to some data experts, attend some workshops, network with colleagues, friends, and some Chmura folks. Now, you may be thinking, Ritz-Carlton, I can't afford that, but we got a really good price, and I'm sure that Holden will be getting some more information out to you soon on that. But if you want to contact him ahead of time, here's his email address so that you can do that. So again, we've already started to line up the speakers, and we'll be getting out an agenda soon. So with that, let me now start with the national overview, and then we'll turn it over to Greg for the job forecast. In terms of the nation, GDP, the broadest indicator, we'll be seeing first quarter soon, and it's slowed down considerably, in part because of the COVID variant was surging at the time. Last presentation, I spoke a good bit about long COVID and its impact on the labor market. I won't be doing that again today, but this website, solvelongcovid.org, has a lot of interesting research on it. If you want to see how that's impacting individuals and the workforce, you can find it there. Inflation continues to rise. We'll look at a slide there. And then what impacts long-term economic growth? And that's important to talk about within the context of inflation, because inflation is part of a driver there. And then that leads to the question of how much will interest rates rise? So we'll go through this rather quickly, and then we'll turn it over to Greg, who will talk about forecasting jobs in JobsEQ. So the national overview, again, GDP, the broadest indicator of economic activity. And if you've been at our demos, our webinars before, you know that a recession is defined across the world as 2 consecutive declines in GDP. But here in the US, we have the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research, that looks at monthly data. GDP is quarterly, and they determine when the recession began and ended. So here you see the Great Recession, worst recession since the Depression, because it was long and it was deep, but not as deep as we saw because of COVID. The COVID recession was 2 months long, but those 2 months straddled the first and second quarter. So you see it's 2 quarters long here. Here we're looking at first quarter again. It slowed down considerably because the Omicron variant. Notice that when we had the Delta variant that was surging in the US, we had strong GDP growth that slowed. Here, when we look at the forecast, we're still looking at very good economic growth. Anything better than 2% is considered very strong. So again, over the next year, year and a half, we're assuming strong growth because of the bounce back from COVID, because of all of the stimulus money that's been put into the economy. And we'll get into some of the risks a little bit later in this presentation with what could cause that long-term growth to actually end up in recession. So we've got complications with inflation. The consumer price index, here, gray shaded areas, recession, percent change from a year ago, nearly 8% change from a year ago. And that's actually not the number that the Fed pays more attention to. They look at the PCE, which is the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index. That's in black here. It is up considerably, 6% from a year ago, but not as much as the CPI. The Fed likes the PCE better because the basket or the goods change every month based on what consumers are purchasing, whereas the CPI, it's a fixed basket of goods that only change every couple of years. So again, PCE, much more accurate in terms of inflation. We are seeing inflation going up, and what then the Fed gets concerned about is if we start to see wages going up, and then not only are individuals asking for pay increases based on how much it's gone up in the past, but if they start to think inflation expectations is going up in the future, then that's even more of an increase in salaries that will be expected by individuals. And here you see last recession, the current recession, and wages are now up 7%, 7.1%, private sector wages. This is all compensation. And so something that the Fed is a bit worried about. At first, they thought it was going to be transitory, and it's not turned out to be that. And so there is concern. And when we think about the Fed and what they're trying to do, this chart sort of illustrates it. Consider this line to be GDP. If we can get the economy to grow at some non-inflationary growth rate, let's say it's 1.8%, then we'll see the economy grow longer. And when we do go into recessions, the dip will not be as deep, but then when we expand, the peak won't be as strong. So what's happening is when we see a lot of inflation pressures, the unemployment rate is low, so you see wages going up. Capacity utilization rates, so factory usage is high, so we have slower deliveries, so factories can increase their prices. Then we see inflation pressure. So when that happens, high inflation is bad for the economy, so the Fed starts to increase interest rates to slow down the economy to get it back to that non-inflationary growth rate. If we're in an economy where we're underutilizing, the unemployment rate is high, what we saw 2 years ago during the COVID recession, they decreased interest rates to try to encourage the economy to grow. So how do you determine what that growth rate of the economy is? So here I'm showing you different decades of time or different times in history, and there are two factors that affect it. You've got potential labor force growth, and that's rather simple to forecast because people are born, and then when they get to be 18 or 22, they find jobs, or at least you hope they do. And so that number, again, easy to forecast. And in the 70s and 80s, you saw a high labor force growth rate, and that was because of the baby boomers coming into the economy. More women were coming into the labor force. And then the other factor that we have to predict is productivity. So how many people are coming into the economy and how much can they produce per hour? And here you saw back in the 1970s to 80s, a very low productivity growth rate. You add the two together and that gives the potential growth rate for the economy. So back then, the economy could grow as fast as 3% consistently without the Fed having to worry about raising rates. Let's fast forward now to 2020 to 2030. Labor force has slowed to 0.4%. And productivity, this is the one that we economists will all disagree with each other about. 1.4% is what the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, is forecasting. Together, that gives us that 1.8% potential GDP growth rate that the Fed is looking toward. So if we can see the productivity growth rate faster, then we can actually see the economy growing faster, the Fed allowing the economy to grow faster. And so when Greg later talks about long-term growth is how the forecasts are based on, it's assuming this long-term growth rate rather than trying to forecast the peaks and the troughs. So again, now we're in a situation where inflation is going up. The Fed is in this place where they're having to raise interest rates to slow down the economy, to bring it back to a more normal level. So when we look at interest rates, here right now, I'm looking at the Fed funds rate at the bottom, which has been essentially zero since this pandemic started. The Fed wanted to be very stimulative to help overall growth. This is the only rate that the Fed can directly affect. And the Fed funds rate is the overnight rate that banks use to lend to each other. But when the Fed raises the Fed funds rate, the higher maturities, such as a 2-month, 3-month, 6-month, they all start to inch up. And even so, at the long end, we have the 10-year that will inch up as well. But the 10-year is more driven by inflation expectations. So if we're concerned about inflation, you can have the 10-year bond going up. Prime rate here is just 2.5 percentage points or 250 basis points above what the Fed funds rate is. Now, this 10-year is very important because it drives 30-year mortgage rates. And you may say, well, 10-year, but 30-year mortgage rate, that doesn't make sense. So the reason why the mortgage rates are tied to the 10-year is because people typically don't stay in a house but for 7 years. And so that's why it's tied to the 10-year rather than a 30-year rate. So what are they going to look like in the future? Here you see what interest rates did over the past couple of years. And there's a group called the Blue Chip Financial Forecasters. It's a magazine that comes out monthly. About 50 economists give their forecasts for various interest rates and GDP. Xiaobing, Shuai, and myself are one of the 50 or so economists that contribute to this. Others like Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs or Citibank are some of the others. But what are they saying right now? They're saying that in the fourth quarter of this year, the federal funds rate, which is now at 0, is going to be at 2%. That's the highest forecast of the 50, 2%. If we just look at the average or the consensus of those 50 economists, they're looking for a Fed funds rate at 1.3% at the end of this year. And again, the reason for this is the Fed is going to try to slow down the economy so that it doesn't grow as fast as it currently is, so that inflation will come back down. The 10-year Treasury is 3.2. That's the highest forecast. The consensus is 2.4%. And then the mortgage rate, if you're thinking about buying a house, now is the time to do it before we see mortgage rates at potentially as high as 4.4% at the end of the year, and the consensus has it at 4.2%. This forecast that these economists do also go forward through the second quarter of 2023. So by then, the Fed funds rate, 2.6% is what one economist thinks. The consensus is 1.8. The 10-year continues to go up to 3.8 with the consensus at 2.7. And the 30-year mortgage, the high, 5.4 with the consensus at 4.5. So right now, the economy is in a slow patch. We expect as the coronavirus continues to decrease, that we're going to see the economy picking up. We now have a situation where the Fed is raising interest rates, and they're behind the 8 ball on this. Typically, it takes 6 to 9 months for it to work through the economy, so they should have been raising rates last year sometime. In fact, I wrote a blog on this a couple of months ago, and Holden, if you could put that blog in the chat for those of you who are interested in getting some more detail on why this all may end up in a recession. We're not forecasting a recession at this point, but how that could unwind. So with that, I guess somewhat negative news, but at this point, again, our most likely forecast does not have a recession in it. We expect to see fairly good growth over the remainder of this year. Let me now turn it over to Greg.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So here we're going to be looking at now the jobs forecast, and especially looking at it in JobsEQ, or also, not in JobsEQ. So for those of you who are looking at other data for that, and some of the considerations to think about when trying to make that forecast about the employment. Now, we talked about in the the title of this whole webinar, we talked about forecast and accuracy. And just one thing to clarify right off the bat is, we don't have a crystal ball. We can't say for sure, exactly how the forecast is going to play out. Just like Chris was alluding to, there's a lot of risks, there's uncertainties out there, and they could go different ways. But what we try to do is we make our best estimates as far as what we expect the pathway to be, and then using these forecasts, there's ways we could accurately apply them to the data that we're working with. So that's important, and I'm going to talk about some of those aspects here as we go through these slides. So first, I'm going to start at the national level. So just talking about the national forecast, and there's going to be two big forecasts I'm going to make a distinction between. So the one forecast I'm going to talk a lot about is the forecast from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They have their employment projections program. I'll talk about it more in the next slides, but it's a long-term 10-year forecast. So that's one forecast to look at. We also have a forecast in JobsEQ, and we actually have two forecasts in JobsEQ. One is what we call our baseline forecast. The other is what we call the Chmura Alternative Forecast. And it happens to be our baseline forecast is really essentially the same thing as that BLS long-term forecast. So at the national level, essentially it's the same thing. We do things to take it down to the regional level that the BLS doesn't do, but really overall, essentially the same forecast, that baseline forecast in the BLS. So I'm going to be contrasting that forecast with what we're doing on our alternative forecast. Now, the employment projection program from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is a little capture from their webpage showing the industry growth rates here. And their latest forecast is for the 2020 through 2030 year. So you see here in the table, they have the historical 2010 employment, 2020, and 2030. So the 2030 is the projection, 2010 and 2020 are the historical data. And they have these all broken down by industry at the detailed industry level. We can see a few of them here. They also have it all broken down by occupation. So they just have the 2020 level and the 2030 level. And also one thing I'd like to point out here on the side, they published this in September of last year. So even though they were already into the 2020 to 2030 time period, that's when they published this projection. Though when they did publish this, since economic data do tend to lag, they didn't have all of 2021 data with at their resources when they made this projection. Really, they just had data through obviously 2020, but also maybe the early part of 2021 as far as seeing where things were going when they made their projections. So they didn't really have the second half of 2021 for the most part when they made this projection. Okay, so when they make these projections, what they've typically been doing is they've been trying to forecast that long-term trend. So this is similar to some of the charts we saw from Chris. But the typical economic cycle we have is going up and down with your peaks and your troughs, your recessions, your expansions, your rebounds, and so forth. And what the BLS has been doing is they have been trying to just stay away from the up and down parts of the cycle and just give us a long-term trend. So where is that long-term trajectory of the economy? And that is what we see here with this line going right through the middle of the chart. So that's what they've historically been trying to project with their EPP employment forecasts. Now, if we look at one of their older forecasts, so when they were forecasting the 2010 through 2020 employment, they had an overall covered employment forecast of 14.9% growth. So it was pretty strong growth that they were expecting for that time period. If we compare that to what they had just a little bit ago, so for the 2019 through 2029 forecast, they were only forecasting 4.2% growth. So about 0.4% per year. So that was a really radical slowing. And the reason for that has to do with the demographics of the population. So what I'm showing you in this graph here is a historical and forecast of the US population for the cohort of people who are age 60 to 65. So that group who are approaching retirement. And we could see here, so this is the baby boomers, as over the last several years, there's really been a lot of growth in people nearing this retirement age. And so because of that, that's been playing into expecting slower growth in the overall economy because of the demographic shift in the labor force. So if you look at this 2019 to 2029, it's about 0.4% per year. Again, Chris was referencing that in her slides as far as what we could expect with the labor force and the expansion of the labor force going forward. All right. Now, if we now look at their 2020 through 2030 forecast from the BLS, they were projecting 8.3% growth. So a big increase in their growth projection. So why did this happen? Well, the reason is because for the first time in a while, their forecast included the recovery from the last recession. So like I said, typically they just project that trend, but because the employment impact of this last recession was just so dramatic and so sharp, and there we see the drop. So we see the trend of employment increasing over the last 10 years, but then the big drop in 2020 due to the pandemic for the most part. In their 2020 to 2030 forecast, their overall growth rate was now the combination of two things. One, that long-term trend, but then adding on to an adjustment for the rebound from this very sharp and deep 2020 trough. All right, so it's a very different approach that they took with this latest forecast. Now, in JobsEQ, here's some look at the employment both historically and going forward, some forecasts. And here, the current time frame, or at least what we're calling current, in quotation marks there, is 2021 Q3. So we have historical data up through that point. Right now, we're working on the Q4 data, but in our system, we have 2021 Q3. So that's what we call the current. And back here, looking, you could see the trough in the second quarter of 2020. So that really deep decline. Now, this is a different starting point from 2020 because we really, if you think of, okay, BLS was projecting from 2020 to 2030, they were projecting from a low point. Whereas right now, we've already recovered some of the jobs we were expecting to recover. So we're already, on our way through that recovery. So if we're projecting forward from the 21 Q3 line, it's going to be a little bit of a different forecast. So right here, this green line, and I should mention, by the way, you got the up and down of the green and the orange off in the forecast. The reason for that variation is that's the seasonality. So it's moving up and down, but that green solid line there is showing us the trend of the direction. So this trend line here is that baseline forecast growth rate. So from that EPP, that's about 0.8% per year. And that's what the trajectory looks like. And in this case, though, I should say, because it incorporates that rebound, it's going to be a little bit on the optimistic side because we're already, well into the rebound. All right. So it's not, very, if you look at the 10-year trajectory of it, it's not horribly off, but it is going to be, you could say, a little bit on the optimistic side compared to maybe what we expect. So what do we expect? So our economists have looked at the recovery period and the long-term growth. And what we're looking at is more like this orange dotted line. And because it has all that seasonality, it's hard to see the trend. So I put in these solid lines to make that trend a little bit more easy to see. So this two sets of orange lines are what we call the Chmura Alternative Forecast. And what we're expecting, at least as in terms of our most recent forecast, was we're expecting, a quicker than average recovery. And then over the next couple of years, we have, since we're still in this rebound phase, we're expecting things to grow a little bit faster than average compared to our long-term rate. But then after we recover, we expect things to flatten out a little bit more and settle more into that long-term trend. So that long-term trend is more that 0.4% per year rather than that 0.8% per year. So this alternative forecast is giving us a different view. Notice that in the short term, it's more on the optimistic side. So we have higher expected growth rate. But then over the long term, if you look out 10 years or so, it's slightly more pessimistic. All right. So in JobsEQ, we offer the ability for our users to use either forecast depending on what assumptions they want to make. So basically, like I said, there's a lot of variability and things change. We had a question I see in the chat about the Ukrainian war, which is a very good question, because there's all of these things that will come up that, will change our expectations over time. So we want to give those alternatives for it. But right now, as our most recent forecast, this was our most likely scenario, right? And there's a lot of variation by sector. So in the last slide I was showing was for overall employment, that's going to vary a lot depending on which industry we're looking at. So as an example of that, here are a couple of the industries. So the orange and the grayish line here, we're looking at accommodation and food and entertainment. And those sectors had about a 40% drop in jobs when the pandemic first hit. And so they've been recovering a lot, but they still have a bit of recovery to go. I mean, right now, we know some of the fourth quarter data based on some other data sets that have been released. So we know that it's been, the jobs have been climbing, and we expect them to continue to climb faster than average, compared to the long term. Other industries, though, definitely are following different trajectories. So here I'm showing in the blue the transportation and warehousing. That one dipped, but because we have, retail shifted in terms of, towards e-commerce coming because of the pandemic. And so we had a lot of job gain. And so those jobs grew past where they were pre-COVID. So already it's basically, past their recovery phase. Another sector that had a different trajectory was the professional, scientific, and technical services. So this was an industry that was not impacted as severely during the pandemic, and we see that too has already surpassed pre-pandemic levels. So there's a lot. These are some sectors that are on more of the extremes, and there's all sorts of different industries that have their own unique pathways. And so when we provide the forecast in JobsEQ, we break it down to the 4-digit level just to capture those variations. And this is a slide just to show that we've been doing these alternative forecasts now since the beginning of the pandemic. And really, we've had to, we feel, because the employment impact was just so sharp and dramatic and impactful that, we needed to provide some better forecasts, especially over the short term, for how to expect things would be moving. And this comes from a blog. You can see the link above that I published at the time. I'm just showing like how valuable these forecasts were. So the gray over here to the left is the historical, to the right is the projected. The gray is the actual employment data. So as we move off into the forecast territory, the blue bars here would be, if we just use the BLS long-term growth rate, what we would have. And the orange is what we are actually providing in JobsEQ. So our preliminary data here in the third quarter and our forecast in the fourth quarter, so our alternative forecast. So those orange bars correspond now with these gray bars, which are data that were published, 3 and 6 months later. So these are the official estimates, and these are what the actual employment turned out to be. And so in this case, our forecasts turn out much closer to the actual compared if we simply used that long-term BLS rate. Okay, now I want to break that down. So that's at the national level. So what about at the local level? So there's additional adjustments when you're doing forecasting that you should pay attention to when you're looking at the local growth rates. So what can you use at the local level? Well, maybe you could use that BLS national forecast as a baseline. The problem is that's not region specific. So, if you're looking at the growth rate in Dallas versus Cleveland, you're going to have different growth rates based on those two regions. So you want to make some kind of adjustment for the region that you're looking at. Some states do produce forecasts. With these, be careful. They are not always filled in. So states forecasts that we've looked at in the past, they might not be filled in for every industry. They might not have any occupations. Some states do, some don't. So that's one downside of those state forecasts. They also tend not to be updated as frequently. Again, this is going to vary depending on the state, but again, from what we've seen, the BLS is a leader in terms of getting their forecasts out in a timely manner and really staying abreast of changing conditions. And even though the BLS, they publish only theirs once a year, I mean, it's a very comprehensive forecast, and a lot of factors are changing. So these forecasts, they're definitely difficult items to keep updated. But especially when we're going through a situation like we have been with the last recession and such sharp, dramatic changes, it makes the timeless even more important. Now in JobsEQ, what do we do? So our employment situation, we update that quarterly. So as far as, what is the current employment, we update that quarterly, and then our forecast is going to be adjusted based upon what the most recent is. And so we're also going to be utilizing the latest BLS forecasts, which, once those are published, we're going to bring that into our update process. Our forecast will also be completely filled out. So the EPP data is filled out, and then we're going to do the same thing as far as applying that to the local level to have detailed projections for all your occupations and your industries. And then we're also going to add in our own piece here as far as customizing the regional growth rate, so that we have, no matter what state, no matter what county you're in, you're going to have a custom forecast based upon that region's metrics. And what are those metrics? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of them here. So we have a model that we use to project every region. And two of the biggest pieces that I'm going to point out here, one of them is the historical performance. So in this case, we're looking here at Seattle, and we have some of their healthcare industries. The bottom line here is the total all industries, so 2 million jobs here. And here's the forecast growth rate over here in the bottom right. So we have 1.5% annual growth over the next 10 years projected for Seattle. So this is the baseline forecast, and at the national level, we expect about 0.8% in that baseline forecast. This is 1.5%, so about 0.7 percentage points higher per year is what we're expecting in Seattle. Now, one of the reasons we're expecting, about 0.7% higher than average is based on the historical performance, and you can see the historical performance right here. Over the last 10 years, Seattle had 1.7% growth, compared to the US, where they had 0.9% average growth. So right there, you could see about that same difference, not exactly the same, but that's one of the pieces we use in our model, like how how fast has this region been growing compared to the nation historically. Another thing we look at is that labor force piece. So that's a really important piece as far as how is the population growing, and more specifically, how is the segment of the population who are going to be working, how is that growing? Here I'm showing a projection, and I'm showing here the state of Washington. The one line, the darker line, is overall population. So it's in the legend 0 to 100 plus. That's everybody. And then the lighter bluish gray line, that's 18 to 65. So in this case, it's just a proxy in this chart for the labor force. Okay, not everybody who's in that age group will be in the labor force, but it's showing you just as a proxy, how that segment is growing. And you can see here it's growing slower than the overall population. So that's significant as well. But what we do is we look at that, and we have more factors that we bring in. We look at also the education of the people, and then the participation rate and how that is expected to be. And so that's another kind of piece of the model. But that underlying population growth of a region is a real important component as far as what we expect for that growth rate in the number of jobs for that area going forward. So we bring those things together, and then we could create something like this. So this is showing you King County, Washington. This is using our Chmura Alternative Forecast. And here we have detailed occupations, and here we're forecasting all the growth rates for those occupations. So this is what we're able to produce with all that information together. Now, occupation projections is also it's a whole new topic. And really, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those occupation projections in a separate section here. So an important piece of the occupation projections are, where are we starting from? Now, one place some of you may be looking at for occupation data is from the BLS and their occupation employment and wage statistics, the OEWS. It used to be called the OES, but they added a W to it recently. And this is a screenshot of their webpage. And when you jump to the data, you could get into a table like this, where you could get into a state or an MSA. And here we have the occupations down the left, and here we have the employment numbers right here, right next to it. Now, this is a very good source of data, and we use it in the inputs to JobsEQ. There's a couple important things to point out. The first one is, right now on the BLS website, the current data is as of May 2020. All right. So it's definitely it's older than other data sets that are out there, especially what we have in JobsEQ. Also, the May 2020, notice that it doesn't match up exactly with the BLS EPP forecast, which is going from 2020 overall to 2030. Okay, now May 2020, you're saying, well, it's kind of in 2020, and you're right. But the way they do their data in the OEWS is they benchmark. It's a survey completed over 3 years, and they do it twice a year in November and May. And they benchmark their employment numbers to the most recent November and May. So really, the employment numbers we're seeing here, it's an average of November 2019 and May 2020. All right. So those 2 months together, they're not necessarily a good representation of all of 2020. So one thing to keep in mind is these data don't match up with that starting point of that EPP forecast. All right. So it's a little bit of a time disconnect. And most of the time, frankly, that's not a big deal, or too much of a big deal. But especially because of the sharp pandemic decline, I mean, it's going to really be a more of a pointed problem in this case. The other thing to keep in mind is that these OEWS, they don't include certain segments. They don't include agriculture. They also don't include the self-employed. And depending on the occupation, that could be a pretty sizable difference in terms of what you're looking at here. Also, these are based on a sampling of regional employers. So it's not a census. They're not talking, it's not like the QCEW data where they have a census of all the employers. This is just a sampling of regional employers. So there's more variation in these data, less accuracy. And they even give you here the standard errors. So if you look at this column here with these percentages, these are the standard error for these estimates. And some of the standard errors could be pretty large. So here we have for the public relations and fundraising managers, it's almost 10%. So that means if you're you're doing a 95th confident confident interval, 95% confidence interval in this estimate of 570, it's basically about plus or minus 20% because of this. So it's, maybe going from very roughly 470 to 670. So it's a pretty wide interval there in terms of their sampling error. And there's also the non-sampling error, which even adds to it. So anyway, I mean, and I don't mean to disparage these estimates. They're great data as far as a fantastic data source for what they're trying to measure, but there is that uncertainty in there. There's another level of uncertainty in terms of how people identify occupations. And here's another blog you could look at in case you're interested in reading more. But, because they're asking individuals information to classify these occupations, it introduces some gray areas. So, it's very easy to tell the difference between a welder and a registered nurse. But what if you're trying to tell the difference between a food service manager and a first-line supervisor of food preparation workers? All right, those are two actual 6-digit occupations, and they fall into two different 2-digit SOC groups, but yet they're pretty similar. Now, there is a difference between the two, but even for an expert in the SOC codes, it could sometimes be different to distinguish between those occupations. And so even more so, like when you're working with the OEWS, when you're coming from, whoever's at this company, the HR people who are filling out these surveys, how accurate is that going to be compared to, let's say, the ACS data, which is based on a survey of the population? That's going to be different. And in the blog, I talk about where you could see that, these data are not consistent with each other. Something is awry here. They're just not, they're not giving us the same answers, and there's a contradiction between the two data sets. But anyway, bottom line here, just another little thing to point out, that these occupation data, they can be a bit fuzzy. And so as you work with them, just kind of to be aware of those uncertainties in the underlying data sets. Now, what we try to do with JobsEQ is we also utilize their industry occupation mix data, which is showing you here. This is also part of their employment projections program. And this is one way we use to help validate those data, which can vary a lot at the local level, just to make sure that the estimates we're getting line up with good expectations when we look at the industry staffing patterns that we'd expect in a region. This is also a way we use to help complete the data. Sometimes those OEWS data are not filled out completely. And we also know, like I said, they're behind the times by maybe a year or more. So we also want to bring those forward. So this gives us a way to bring those data forward. So our occupation data don't have to be stuck in May 2020, but can be as of like the third quarter of 2021 or wherever we need it to be. So that's a tool we use to help bring it forward. So that gets us to this point. And here I wanted to show you when you're doing these projections at the local level, and kind of when the rubber meets the road, what are we looking at here? And so here I'm looking at the Nashville MSA, and we have at the top we have Cooks, and this is the baseline forecast, and at the bottom we have that Chmura alternative forecast, same thing, Cooks. And if we look at far to the right, we have the employment growth. So over the next 2 years, so it's the 2-year forecast, we could see here that we're expecting about twice as much growth among these cooks than if we just use that long-term growth trend. So this is this one, I definitely cherry-picked this example to find an occupation that was in an industry that still has a lot of rebound to occur over the short term. So when we're expecting, restaurants to be bouncing back because of the lifting of restrictions. So we're expecting higher growth there than the long-term trend would suggest. Now, what we use though, and a lot of, I know you use who are especially in economic development, workforce development, education, and so forth, is looking at the total demand, excuse me, for the occupation. So the total demand also takes into account separations as people retire. What do we need to educate to come into the labor force to make sure we have a good supply of workers, that's going to be the total demand number. And it includes those separations. So we see in between the purple and the red, the exits, people who leave the labor force, the transfers, people moving from one occupation to another. We need to account for those folks. And the difference in those numbers is going to be not as dramatic as the growth. So even with this very dramatic example in terms of the different growth, the total demand is only going to be off by 24%. So not quite as steep as we have just based on growth. And if we look at a more long-term example, and one without that sharp increase expected, we're going to see something even more moderate. So, excuse me again, if we look at registered nurses over 10 years, now in Nashville again, the baseline versus the alternative, the difference in growth is not going to be that dramatic. So 3,800 on the more optimistic side, 3,700 on the more pessimistic side. So not a huge difference there. And if we look at the actual demand, it's going to be even closer. So because of the separations is so much tied to the current employment situation, that difference overall in the demand isn't going to be all that dramatic. All right. So a number of things to keep in mind there in terms of, definitely those forecast differences will make a difference depending on what you're looking at and depending on what metric you're looking at, especially if you're looking at, that job growth aspect. In terms of the demand, though, it won't be as much. So that concludes my presentation. So now I'm going to turn it back to Holden to take some questions.
Yes. So one of the first questions we got in the chat was during Chris's section. Nikki Howard asked, was your forecast done before or after the Ukraine war?
Yeah, good question, Nikki. So the invasion to Ukraine started February 24th, and the forecast from the blue chip was March 1st, was when that was produced. So that would be most of them produced as it was starting, as it has gone on. And I saw you had another good question about supply chain and impacts. Of course, the biggest impact here to the U.S. is the price of oil. So we've seen that go up. So that's contributing to inflation. So the numbers that I showed you do not yet have that added increase from the Ukraine war. So we'll still probably inflation will get to double digits at this point in the next couple of months. Ukraine has a lot of farming in it and grain. And now is the planting season. Obviously, there's no planting going on there right now. And so they serve more Europe than us, but clearly all of this ripples across the globe. So the Ukraine war, the invasion, yes, I would expect to continue to have an increase in inflation. Some of the minerals that come out of that area of the country in Russia are used in high-tech products. So that's something else we'll be watching closely.
We have another question from Nikki, and Chris or Greg, both of you feel free to answer this, or one of you. She asked, for the forecasted job growth, are you including entry-level job wages? For example, if an entry-level job offers $12 and another offers $15, do you expect a higher wage to persuade entry-level candidates to choose one occupation or industry over the other?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that reminds me, so what we've seen over the last year is a lot of increase in wages that have varied from patterns we've seen in the past, and especially in some of those lower wage jobs, we've seen a lot of dramatic increases. And really, that's been happening, like I said, over the last year approximately. Remember that BLS forecast? I mentioned that they produced it in September of last year. So they had limited access to a lot of the trends we've seen that really kind of more solidified as the year progressed, and we had more data on it. So certainly they take into account, or they try to take into account, things that they've seen up to that point, but really they could not have captured that completely like we've seen as more data have become available as far as seeing that kind of wage growth. One thing that we've really started to lean on a lot as time has over these last couple of years is our job posting data. So our real-time intelligence, as we call it, just because things have been changing, conditions have been changing so quickly. Those are giving us a good way to stay on top of things as they change maybe month to month, to see how the job market might be changing. Are people offering more jobs in certain industries or whatnot? So all I'll say is, we're as far as the occupation level, we're basing that based on the BLS last forecast, which they produced again in September of last year.
So, Holden, I see another one for Greg that I think he should answer. How do you account for new emerging occupations or industries? I'm thinking of something like cyber, Greg. How do we account for that? It's another reason why we have job postings, because you can identify that in job postings, but it's not yet an SOC code.
Right, exactly. I'd say that's the answer. With the traditional data sources that are coming from the BLS, there's always that lag as far as things getting into those data. And right, those having like our job postings, we update that daily, and we're able to look at trends like that as far as what jobs are emerging, if things are happening locally, conditions changing with the wages and so forth. But those are the best data to really try to stay on top of those emerging occupations.
Yeah, and what I like to do for that one is put in, say, the word cyber, and because you can query, all the job descriptions and find all of the ads that have the word cyber in it. And then I go to the top and I see what occupations are listed that had cyber noted in them. And then I create a special cyber related occupation grouping that I can then search on later, if that makes any sense.
We have another question. This one from Rick Clifton. Do you feel that providing daycare incentives would bring people into the job market?
Well, if we look at the participation rate, it's affected women more than men. More women you would expect to be handling daycare. So that is one of the policies that a lot of people point toward as increasing participation rates, either having some support or providing daycare or providing some sort of credits for daycare.
Mm-hmm. And then we have another question from Mike McBride. How are you handling retirements in the projected exit/re-entrance into the labor force? There's a lot of data that retirements were much higher than anticipated, but now with the stock market down, some folks may be encouraged to return to work in some capacity.
Right. That's a good question. So with, at least at the occupation level, and what I was showing in those last couple slides were the separation rates, which included those exits. So people who exit the labor force, might be retirement, but it might be, exiting for going to school or something else. All of those are based on data from the BLS. Again, it's from that employment projections program that they have, and they collect those data by occupation. So every occupation, what they expect in terms of those types of separations, in terms of the transfers and the retirements. And again, their last published data set was from September of last year, and even so, their data collection was probably preceded that by a good bit of a time frame. So, you're right. Exactly. There are some things that we're seeing, that these emerging trends that they're not getting captured in those rates yet. So that's something to keep in mind.
Nikki Howard asked to kind of follow up with the daycare question. Do you see any suggestions as to how companies can help increase the labor participation rate?
How companies in general can increase it? Well, one is sort of tags on to Mike's question there. We did see retirements increase significantly. And so some of those individuals are wanting to come back, but they may want some flexibility. So I think if companies were to offer more flexibility to attract some of the retired folks back, that would likely help. We look at the 16 to 19-year-old category, the younger group, they actually dropped in terms of participation. Then right now they're back up to about where they were pre-COVID. So we see more young people coming in, taking some of the jobs that are open. But even so, there's still 5-6 percentage points in terms of participation, less than they were 20 years ago. So we need to figure out how to attract the younger folks back into the labor force. And then, like I said, we talked a lot about long COVID in the previous presentation, and to the degree that some people are now disabled and can't work because of long COVID, that's going to be a reduction in our labor force over the longer run.
Thank you, Chris. We've got another question. Do you see the recent administration's push for EVs and clean energy to surcharge the labor needed in those industries?
I'm sorry, to what charge the labor in those industries? The last part of that, Holden?
To surcharge the labor needed?
To surcharge the labor needed. So go ahead and read the whole question to me again, if you can.
Sure. Do you see the recent administration's push for EVs and clean energy to surcharge the labor needed in those industries?
Well, it's kind of interesting that policies, oil prices are going to do more than policies will for electric vehicles and other, other like solar and other alternative sources of energy. And so to some degree, yes, there's going to be a increased need for workers in, to manufacturing those type of products. I mean, Kentucky, I think, or not Kentucky, was it, I'm not sure which state received the huge Ford plant that they're going to be building. It's going to spill over into Kentucky. But yes, there's going to be huge demand for workers in those areas to build the electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. And we don't have enough workers right now. And so there's going to be a huge demand for people to get skilled in the occupations such as mechatronics and the other things that are going to be needed to build these electric vehicles.
All right, looks like we've got two more quick questions from with the rate of inflation, should we expect to see newer minimum wage standards to drop back down at some point, particularly those in excess of $20, and then parentheses, banks, insurance, etc.?
Okay, I got distracted by Jeff and Jimmy. Thank you. Yes, the Ford plant's going to be in Tennessee, and then some of the batteries are flowing over into Kentucky. So go ahead and ask that question again, Holden.
Sure. With the rate of inflation, should we expect to see newer minimum wage standards drop back down at some point, particularly those in excess of $20?
Yeah. No. Once we see wages go up, they won't go down. So we'll be just at a newer level, at a bumped up higher level in terms of what individuals are paying and price levels. So the more important thing, I think, to us we economists is how fast is that rate going up? So if minimum wage goes up to 20 or these higher paying jobs goes up to 20 and they stay there, well, they can't stay there because inflation won't be going up 8 or 9 or 10% every year going forward. At least we hope the Fed will get that under control. It'll be going up 2%. So we would expect to see that $20 rising at a 2% rate over time.
All right. And then our final question, just a point of clarification on the data For remote workers, would they show up in a geography that they actually live in, or a geography of where their work/headquarters is physically based?
That would be for Greg. Greg, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm there. So I want to be careful with this one because I'm kind of wondering to see how things might be a little bit different right now. And two, the other thing we're kind of dealing with is, kind of the lag in data reporting, and certain data sets, we're not seeing some new conditions, that may be emerging. But I know with at least, with the QCEW, that in general, it's going to be, where their work is. But I know there's some exception. That's why I'm hesitant to even give you an answer, Mike. I'm sorry, because I know there's this odd exception, and I don't want to misrepresent it, because they sometimes have those unknown regions, and it's you might not even notice them. But if you see, for example, you'll see Massachusetts unknown region, rather than being in a specific county. And I know they have some specific rules about people being in a different state. So I almost hesitate to give you a definitive answer without double checking my notes on that one, so I don't say it wrong. But I mean, this is something I could look up, and we could follow up with you on it.
Yeah. And Greg, work from home, have you done a blog on that, on how prevalent that is in the ads these days?
Yeah, that's definitely something that we're, continue to track. And we've seen, different trends there. I know Chris was recently writing something about it, and you were seeing in the BLS survey how there was a certain decline over some recent months, with people, more people going back to the office. But in the ads, really just very recently, we've seen kind of an increase. But, that might only be, it's an increase in how explicit they're being, because we see a lot of volatility in the ads sometimes with different trends. And it could certainly be, maybe sometimes they weren't being explicit. Now they're being more explicit. So really, we're trying to gather more data to really see how things play out. But definitely, we seem to be at some kind of flex point in terms of what's happening there.
Yeah. And if there is some more interest in that, I just finished a blog. If you go to our site and under blog, it'll be the last one that I've written on that subject.
All right. Well, seeing as it is past 4:30 now, I just want to thank everyone for attending and being so engaged, both with your questions and your chats and all of that. So again, thank you for attending. I will get these slides and recording out tomorrow afternoon. So everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Mm-hmm.